Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to a primer on pricing. I considered calling this a Price is Right, continue with the long history in our industry of, IP theft. But I don't need the ghost of Bob Barker showing up at my house. Anybody who has seen Happy Gilmore knows that man knows how to throw a punch. My name is Aaron Gore. I am a certified Cicerone, former full-time brewery consultant, and presently the director of strategic partnerships for Community Brewing Ventures, helping discover, produce, and accelerate the most innovative craft brands in the beverage industry or something like that. We're pretty cool. Look us up. I'm also going to ask that everybody bears with me a little today. I have a 2-year-old, and she has decided that what she wants to be when she grows up. When I move around a bit, my audio goes a tad out. Oh, thank you, Andrew, for that heads up. Is this better, everyone? And I was just about to tell everybody to bear with me. Like I said, I have a 2-year-old. She has decided that when she gets older, she wants to be a plague rat. So she has given me her death cold. So if you see me hacking while the thing is on mute, that is because I am highly contagious. So leave that alone. Moving on into our topic today, we are going to get into pricing. Now, I will start this off like I find myself doing almost every time I present, not talking about what I will be talking about, but talking about what I will not be talking about. When it comes to pricing, I know a lot of people are probably tuning in and expecting me to tell them what they should be pricing their beer at. Not going to do that. Problem is, there's just too many variables. Pricing doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the wild. And a whole ecosystem of different variables, of different breweries who are pricing their own products, different products that each have different features and they each have different qualities to the consumer, and that's always changing. So rather than trying to tell you what you should be pricing your beer at, what I'm going to try and do is explain how you should go about coming up with that yourself, and some of the strategies, some of the tips, the tricks, and some of the rationale that goes into pricing structure. And if you're asking yourself why I'm qualified to speak on this, it's because Andrew approved my presentation, so take that. I've also taught at the college level on this, but that's far less fun. All right, so when we're talking about price, what is price? Everybody has a pretty good idea of what price is. We intuitively understand it. It's what you pay for stuff, but why is it important, and how does that really affect the consumer and how you should be pricing your own product? Well, the most important factor of price is that it is the second most important aspect of whatever product that you're selling. And I say second most important because the most important is need fulfillment. But what is need fulfillment? Take it for a second. So need fulfillment is how well your individual product actually suits the requirements, suits the needs, suits what a customer is looking for. If, for example, I really want an apple and you're selling apples, then you are fulfilling my need. That's a wonderful thing. Now, let's say that I'm really in the market for apples and all you're selling is signed copies of MC Hammer's debut album. Well, you better really hope that I like parachute pants and I'm not nearly as hungry as I thought I was. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble because you're not really fulfilling my need of an apple at all. Seems pretty straightforward. However, take apples and oranges. Classic comparison. An orange is not an apple. So if I'm in the mood for an apple and someone is selling apples and you're selling oranges, then yeah, I'm probably going to buy the apple and not your orange. But if your orange is selling for half the price of an apple, well, then it is a fruit. It is refreshing. It is a little sweet. So maybe it's going to fulfill enough of my need that price differential is going to be more important than the fact that the other product is exactly what I'm looking for. So that's what I mean by need fulfillment. The less differentiated two products are, the more important price is. And the further differentiation that you have between them, the less price matters, because at that point you still have to fulfill the customer's need. Not only that, but as the craft beer industry has become more and more crowded, it's become a lot more important out in the marketplace. Not necessarily between, for example, your brewery and Bud Light. At that point, there's really no comparison. Again, it needs fulfillment. What Bud Light does is, be bad water is very different than what your IPA or even your wit beer will be doing. But with 8,700 breweries in the U.S., with almost every major metro area having literally dozens of breweries, there is going to be someone out there who is doing the same thing that you are doing. Not only that, it would be the height of hubris to consider yourself the only one doing it to do what a customer would consider high quality. So there are bound to be people who are matching your product. You cannot be as differentiated as you probably think that you are, because at the end of the day, almost every single brewery has the ability to make almost every single type of beer, which means that if you're going to be differentiating yourself, it has to come in a few forms. Either you can differentiate yourself on price, or if you are priced competitive with the rest of the market, you need to differentiate yourself in ways like branding, differentiate yourself in things like service, market access, points of distribution, because those are going to be the things that make up the difference. As you can see, those are harder and harder, and the further you move towards those, the more you're into the realm of need fulfillment. Once you're looking at these equivalent products, and especially if you have someone who's competing directly with you, you have to be able to understand the effect price is going to have on how customers consider your offerings. It's also important to keep in mind that your cost has nothing to do with what a customer is willing to pay for a product. Look at lagers, for example. Now, there's a lot of lagers that are very cheap to make, but they also take a lot of time in the tank, especially if you're approaching your maximum capacity. Then, that residency time can be very, very costly. Customers don't care about that. They know that Bud Light's a Pilsner. Pilsner. If you can't see the air quotes, they're about as dramatic as possible on that. But they know that it's a lager, and they associate lagers with cheap, and they associate lagers with a relatively low base price point. So even if you are positioning yourself as a luxury lager and you're charging $13 or $14 for a 4-pack, for the customer, that's about as high as they're willing to go. Whereas if you're talking, for example, a bourbon barrel-aged imperial stout or even a hazy IPA, yes, those can be more expensive products to make, but for the consumer, what they're seeing are quality cues. It's all about the relative price. So keep in mind that for a customer, the price has nothing to do with what it costs you to make a product. It all has to do with how they value that. So make sure that you're either communicating or creating a narrative or creating those differentiators that can justify a higher or a lower price, or that you are staying competitive with what the consumer expectation will be. It's also important to remember that if you're going through distribution, especially, there is going to be an added cost for each of those distribution tiers. I know anybody who is in the industry, you know this already, but it's something that you have to constantly keep in mind. You can have your pricing structure worked out as well as you can, but unless you understand what kind of margins your wholesaler will be looking for, or even if you're in self-distro, what kind of margins that the retailer will be looking for, that makes a huge difference when it comes to the final price that is going to be paid by the consumer. And that's because price isn't a single thing. Price comes across a spectrum. It's a life cycle. It changes as it travels through these tiers, and you have to keep in mind all of the effects that were going to take place on what the final consumer is going to be seeing sitting on the shelf and what it's going to be priced at. Because as far as they're concerned, that's the only thing that matters. They don't care that the wholesaler wanted their 30% margin. They don't care that the retailer needs to keep their own lights on, and so they took a margin. What they care about is the fact that they could get somebody else's product for cheaper. So make sure that you don't lose sight of those differences as you travel through the life cycle of price. So this is just a little visual to give you an idea of exactly that life cycle. You have the PTW, that's the price to wholesaler. That's what you will be charging to the distributor as you sell them your product. They'll in turn add their margin, typically around 30%, and they'll sell it off to the retailer, who will in turn charge their margin. Now, retailer margins vary wildly depending on the actual retailer. You can get everywhere down from 20 to 25%, all the way up to 45, 50%. And draft beer, as we know, has a much higher margin added by the retailer. So just keep that in mind, because all that works out to the price to consumer. And that last one, that PT, is all important, because for the people you actually want to get your liquid to, the people who you want it to be putting it in their mouths or putting it in their fridge, PTC is the only thing that they see. And it's the only thing that they care about because it's what affects them directly. Now this tab, this particular slide, if you're going to go ahead and mark nothing down from this entire conversation, please go ahead and screenshot this. I'll actually leave this up just for a second so that you can, before we get into any additional things about the different pricing structures, about the different strategies, tips, and tricks, that you need to understand the difference between margin and markup, because it's a big one, and I see these two misused all the time. Markup is when you have a particular cost on your end and you apply a multiplier, a markup to it of a certain percentage. So if you have a 40% markup, you're multiplying your cost by 1.4, and that gives you what your final price will be. Is how much of that final price, percentage-wise, is not included in the cost. These are very different concepts that are capturing much of the same information, but you need to know how to convert one to the other, because different scenarios are going to have you either working forward or backwards, and you're going to need to be able to run those conversions on the fly. So these formulas are the easiest way to do that. Just keep in mind that with margin, treat it as a percentage. So if it is a margin of 25%, it is not 25, that is 0.25. So 0.25 divided by 1 minus 0.25 will give you what the markup winds up being. So there are two primary pricing models, kind of the standard pricing models that you'll see around the industry. You'll actually see other more involved pricing models in a lot of CPGs, consumer packaged good markets. In beer, because it is a regulated substance, you have a little less flexibility when it comes to the pricing, and also a lot of those higher end or more complex pricing structures are more useful to larger companies. So you won't typically see it involved in craft beer in any sort. Even some of the larger craft breweries wouldn't be able to really get utility. So the first one, and the most common one that I see around the industry, is what's called cost plus. And this is a very, very simple way of working out what price you're going to charge, whether that's to the wholesaler, or if you're self-distributed, to the retailer, or if you're talking about your tap room, to the customer. What you do with this is you work out the necessary average markup for that particular channel. It's important to get an average markup because you will inevitably have certain products that cost more, certain products that cost less. You need to understand on average what you need to make a particular product to justify making it, to really clear all of your costs on it and have enough left over on average to be able to pay for any of your fixed costs, any of the other things that just come with running the business, keeping the lights on, for example. Once you've worked out your necessary average markup, you go ahead and just multiply how much the product costs you to make by that markup percentage, and that gives you exactly what you'll be charging. You can always, hedge up to the nearest dollar or something along those lines, but it's a very, very simple pricing structure, and that's the beauty of it. That's the advantage of it, is the fact that it keeps things consistent as far as your margins are concerned, and it is very easy and intuitive to understand and to work with. Now, the biggest issue with doing a cost plus model is that it can lead to some very unstrategic pricing choices. The only real input that you're putting into determining what you're going to charge is your cost, which is very important. I mean, obviously, you got to be able to make your nut and keep your business open, but it doesn't take into account the realities of your competition or of consumer expectations or of the actual value that you're providing to the customer. So it can actually lead to you overcharging on products, which can lead to sitting on shelves and scaling out, or just sitting in a warehouse somewhere at the retailer or the wholesaler. Or, almost as bad, it can lead to you undercharging when you could get more value out of a particular product by pricing it more competitively. The alternative, and kind of the inverse, is the value-derived pricing model. So effectively, this finds the competitive price. This finds what a particular product would normally sell for by your competition in the market, what its going rate is, and it works backwards to figure out what you can charge respectively along the way with respect to what part of the tier you're in. So, for example, let's say that you have an IPA, and in your market, West Coast IPAs are selling for $12 a 4-pack of 16-ounce cans. You work back from that, and you take into account the fact that the retailer's got to get their 30%. You work backwards from there, taking away the wholesaler's 30%, and then you work back to the price that you're able to charge to the wholesaler. From there, you need to figure out what your minimum acceptable margin needs to be. What amount of money do you need to make to justify making a beer? And what this does is it allows you to really come backwards and see, before you even introduce a product to the market, if the pricing is going to be at a level that allows you to actually move it. I see a lot of people who look at this method of working out what they're going to be charging, and they say, well, we calculated it out on this beer we want to make, and it's going to be under what we can. If we do it this way, it's going to be under the margin that we can reasonably work off of. And they see that as being some sort of invalidation, and it's really not, because what that should be telling you is that one of two things either needs to happen. Either you need to sell it at the price that you need to make your appropriate margin, in which case you either have to justify that increased price, whether that's through a narrative, whether that's through differentiation, whether that's through looking at your competitors and leaning on your locality, what have you, or you need to accept the fact that you're probably going to have a lot of product that's going to be sitting at the wholesaler or sitting at the retailer if it's able to get that far, or sitting on the shelf if it's able to get that far. So you need to be able to justify your ability to participate in the market. And if you have a beer that you've worked out and you cannot produce it at a cost that will give you an acceptable margin for the price you need to actually move it in the market and move it through the wholesaler, through the retailer, then that should probably be a sign that you should be making that beer. We have this tendency in the craft beer industry to want to make whatever we want to make or whatever we think customers want us to make without any consideration of the business realities that are behind it. And that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. It's important to follow your artistry, to follow the quality, to follow what consumers are telling you they want. But if you can't give them what they want at a price that's acceptable to them, then you're not really fulfilling that need for them in the first place. So in general, I tend to recommend that people go with that value-derived pricing strategy. It is a little more work. It is a bit of a headache, and it can lead you to sometimes having to make the decision that, no, you can't throw a fifth contracted hop variety into that IPA if you can't afford to charge $38 a 4-pack for it. But these are the decisions that you have to make if you want to be able to strategically participate in the market and make sure that you're positioning yourself well. And it's not about necessarily being cheaper either. It's about making sure that you're pricing smartly. Oftentimes that means being competitive. There are times when it means pricing above your competition, but we'll get into that in a second. So a couple of pricing tips and tricks. The first one we're going to dive into is actually going to be the one that is the probably the most familiar to people, charm pricing. And if you're saying to yourself, I don't know what charm pricing is, I don't think it's that familiar, well, trust me, you are familiar with it. If you've ever been to a store and you've seen something priced at $4.99 instead of $5, congratulations, that is charm pricing. All it means is pricing things at a lower price to trick the mind into only looking at that leftmost number, that leading number. In general, the thought is that when people see $4.99, what they see is $4 plus 99 cents that they're probably not even reading, as opposed to seeing $5, and so they associate it with being cheaper. There's a few problems with this, though, as it pertains to craft beer, and there's a reason I tend to recommend against it. First and foremost is that the majority of consumers of craft beer are millennials and now Gen Z. There's quite a bit of study out there now that shows that while older generations, Gen X and boomers and above, do tend to respond to charm pricing exactly how you'd expect, millennials and Generation Z have grown up with it so long and tend to be more willing, rather, to spend a little extra money for higher quality, that when they see $4.99, they think $5. They don't think $4, as opposed to older generations. So not only does it not necessarily work, but it also tends to make the product feel a little cheaper than it actually is. Not more affordable, but cheaper, which is a problem because at the end of the day, craft beer is a luxury good. It's an affordable luxury good. And I know for a lot of us, our lives would not be the same without it. It's hard to believe it's not a necessity, but it really is not. It is a luxury item. And when you make it feel cheaper, it does cheapen it somewhat in the eyes of the consumer as well, and not in a positive way. So if it has any effect at all, in general, charm pricing will have a negative effect. Now, it's not something you really have to worry about when it comes to selling products to wholesalers. At the end of the day, they tend to be very sophisticated consumers in the sense that they build a lot of their purchasing pattern off of strict margins and off of KPIs and metrics. But even if you're selling self-distro to retailers, and particularly if you're selling direct to consumer, in general, what I recommend is just put the price. And rather than putting any sort of sense behind it, sense CENTS, not SENSE, just go ahead and put that single leading digit and do a dash right after it. There's a reason most of the luxury businesses in the world have moved towards exactly that model. It keeps things looking attainable, and it keeps the price looking a lot more honest and a lot higher quality. Now, next up will be exactly that, the perception of quality. And that really is the key component that can really differentiate on how you approach pricing strategy. And it's one of the biggest reasons why I can't tell you what you need to be pricing your beer at. Pricing is funny because it has a huge psychological element as well, particularly with products that are luxury items. This is not really the medium. It'd be a whole separate presentation if I were to get into things like Veblen goods, where the higher the price, the higher the demand. But to a degree, when something is more expensive, consumers tend to associate it with higher quality. Now, keep in mind that the higher price is not an objective thing. It's all relative to the general market price. So, for example, that $14 Pilsner will generally be seen to be of higher quality than a $10 Pilsner, but it will not necessarily be seen to be of lower quality than a $15 barrel-aged Imperial Stout. $15 barrel-aged Imperial Stout for a lot of us would be cheap to the point of suspicious. And for a lot of consumers, they see that as being a sign that it's probably not something worth seeking out because it's probably not of the highest quality. So when it comes to your pricing, keep in mind that if you're pricing competitively with the other products that are fulfilling the same need, you're almost always going to be safe. But if you're pricing lower, then you need to realize the fact that for a large portion of consumers, you're giving them a hint, or at least a perceived hint, that your product is not as high quality. So you need to make that up in other ways, whether it's availability, whether it's volume. Certain styles are also more willing to accept it. In general, the higher associated quality of a particular category, the more the quality is important. So take, for example, that Pilsner. People still buy a crap ton of Bud Light. They buy a crap ton of Bud Light because, in general, easy drinking lagers are something they don't associate with quality already. So the marginal utility of a higher quality, easygoing lager is not something they are particularly concerned with. But if they're already making a luxury purchase, like a huge, pillowy, hazy IPA with Mosaic, Citra, Strata, and Galaxy, then yeah, they want to be a little more assured that the quality is going to be there. And so if you're underpricing, a lot of times that can wind up hurting you a lot more than it would on some of those lighter beers that are more intended for everyday consumption. So just keep in mind, relative to the particular category, whether that's the style, whether that's, all wheat beers in that general, summery beer category, when you're looking at the direct competitors on the market, pricing higher or lower can have a huge effect on how people perceive you without ever even tasting it. Now, when it comes to price changes, I'm presuming some of the people who are on here right now, if you're considering price changes, or if you popped on here to see if you need to do any price changes or how to go about it, one thing I will say is just be careful with those. There's always going to be times when you need to do some sort of alteration to your pricing structure, whether your raw materials will become more expensive, or the opposite, maybe you're able to save some money on raw materials through bulk buying, or you got a grain silo, something along those lines. And you need to adjust your prices across the board. Just be careful with those and make sure that you're always able to justify that. Anytime there's a price change, and this is whether it goes up or down, whoever you're selling the product to is going to have questions as to why. And that's a fair question on their behalf. There's always going to be a reason behind it. And the reason that you give them can never be, we just realized we needed to make more money. That's not good enough for them. They can understand if the cost of raw materials got more expensive. They can't understand that, you really needed to upgrade your car. They tend to frown on that. So when it comes to price increases, make sure that you are able to provide that narrative. You're able to provide that reason. That way, when they look at the new price, they're not getting sticker shock. They understand why. And that needs to carry through all the way to the consumer. It can't be a story that you're only telling to whatever tier you are selling to. Otherwise, that story is going to be lost. And all the end consumer is going to see is the fact that Bock that they really enjoy drinking for $11.99 a 4-pack is all of a sudden $13.99 a 4-pack. It's an important thing to keep in mind. But almost more dangerous is when you are dropping a price. Again, people tend to be trained to expect an increase in price when it comes to quality luxury goods, when it comes to something like craft beer. But when it comes to discounting, it makes people suspicious. If you have a single product that you're discounting, the biggest question in their mind is invariably going to be, why are they discounting it? And the logical next step for them is to assume that it means you're having trouble moving it yourself at its original price, which means they're going to have trouble moving it through their store. And if you're a customer, it says maybe it's not as high quality. So if you're going to be discounting something, you either need to have a good narrative for it, or you need to rest assured that the extra volume, just from people realizing that they can save some money by purchasing it, is going to justify the fact that it may lead people to have a poor perception of its quality. Now, it's going to be even more risky if you're doing any sort of regular discounting. One of the things that a lot of wholesalers love to do is incentive programs. And there's a time and a place for incentive programs and regular discounting programs. But if you're running them, particularly in the long term or at regular intervals, it can lead to a funny effect called bridge buying. Bridge buying is basically where people either buy your product only when it's on discount and then just sit on it and don't buy it again until they have it at that lower price. Or more often, they'll buy enough product when it is discounted to get them through to the next predicted discount. If they know it's going to be dropping in price again in 2 months, then they'll buy 2 months worth of product and sit on it until they can get it at that discount again. There's no reason for them to ever buy it at the higher price if they know it's coming. So make sure that if you're running these incentive programs, they're done strategically, and if they are going on a regular basis, you can only ever expect people to pay that discounted price on average. So you need to know that the discounted margin that you're going to be making on that is something that you as a company are going to be able to live with. Otherwise, you could find yourself succeeding into failure, which can be a very dangerous thing. Now, some other tips and tricks. Tiered pricing. Now, what this means is if you have your pricing all over the board, and this happens a lot in cost-plus models in particular, where you find yourself with a huge range of prices, every single product is individually priced. What that can lead to is basically your pricing isn't working for you. Your customers are choosing their product, they're choosing what fulfills their need, and then they're deciding if the price is right for them. And that creates a level of transactional friction. It makes things a little more difficult for them to actually make the purchase because the pricing is not assisting in that decision-making process. Now, with tiered pricing, it takes a different approach. With tiered pricing, instead, you're going to have multiple tiers, typically either 3 or 5 tiers of set prices. With your individual products, you're going to work out what you need to be charging into one of those tiers, basically whichever one the predicted price is closest to. That means that some of your products are going to fall into a bucket where they're making less margin than you would otherwise expect them to without tiered pricing, but it also means other products will work out into higher tiers and you'll actually make a little more margin on them. But the reason this is important is because of that psychological pricing element. People are funny. If you have 2 products, you have one that's priced 2 tiers, so to speak. You have one that is priced relatively low-end product that's priced relatively low, and you have a mid-range or a high-end product that's priced more on the high side. People will tend to split their purchasing almost exactly between them. If you have 3 tiers, let's say, for example, you have a low-end or entry-level offering at $4, you have a mid-range offering at $6, and you have a high-end balls-to-the-wall offering at $10, then the vast majority of people will trend towards middle. They will trend towards that $6. So you are unconsciously forcing people higher up in those price tiers just by adding one additional tier even higher up. Because now they don't feel like they're splurging at $6. They feel like they're making the reasoned choice without dipping into the bargain basement tier of $4. What's more so is that this effect is actually increased over time, because over time, those entry-level people will still come in and they'll still need an access point, but they tend to trade up in their purchasing, and people very rarely trade down in their purchasing. So you will see more and more people work their way up from that lower tier into the middle, and even some people work their way from the middle all the way to that higher tier. This means that if you can position your highest margin products in that middle tier in particular, that's an excellent way to really maximize your revenue. If you expand it to 5, that's about as many as you can get and still get that effect. And people do the exact same thing. They trend towards the middle. But the important thing is to have those set tiers. And this is especially effective in like a draft setting where you're selling directly to consumers, who are, almost by definition are what you deem unsophisticated customers. And that's not a knock on beer consumers, because this works on everybody, including people like me, people like you. What it means is that when they're sitting there, if they see your cheapest option, they see your middle option, and then they see the fact they'll have to spend $15 on your barrel-aged barley wine with raspberries and truffles, then chances are good they're going to trend toward that middle, which is going to help your bottom line. And if they do decide that raspberries and truffles just sounds good, then, well, that's more power to them as well, and that's more money in your pocket. Now, we're talking about discounting before. There are occasions where discounting can be advantageous. Sometimes playing with your prices and playing with incentive programs can have uses. One of the ones that is used most often and can have great effect is actually called penetration pricing. Now, this is most effective either with a new product or more often with a new market. And what that means is that you run an incentive program or you set your pricing intentionally low when you first enter that market. That way you can maximize the amount of market share you're able to get by undercutting the competition. It's a great way to get that early market share, and anybody who's been in this industry for very long can tell you that, the first, let's say, 6 months that you're in a particular market, that's when you get the most work done. That's when you set the tone for all the market share that you are going to gain or lose going forward. So by running some early incentive programs, even if everybody knows that they will eventually end, the goal is to build up enough brand equity to be able to carry you through even after it does. Now, the important thing with penetration pricing is to make sure that you are able to support not only the demand, and you need to be able to generate enough demand, but you also need to be able to support the volume enough to make an actual impact. If you're making a little tiny impact in the market, then chances are good afterwards that even if you sold more than you otherwise would have, people are just going to move on to the next thing. The goal has to be to put all of your resources there and really make sure that you are landing like a massive dinosaur killing size meteor rather than a little pebble. And that's honestly just good policy in general when introducing new markets. If you're going to just dip a toe into a new market, it's usually not worth opening it up in the first place. Now, the inverse of that is price skimming. Now, this is one that you'll not see often in the craft beer industry, because what price skimming is, it's not a direct inverse, but it's kind of conceptually the inverse. It's where you price something initially high, whether that's entering a new market or more often with a new innovative product. And as the competition catches up, that gives you room to come down on your price so that you've maximized the amount of money that you're making early when you're really the only entry in that particular category or that particular area. Now, the reason this is difficult is manyfold, but in craft beer, one of the biggest problems is that it is such a nimble industry. It takes a matter of weeks for any innovation to be caught up, from breweries on the other side of the planet, much less in your own hometown. So if you position yourself as being too high, then there's nothing to stop the folks from down the street from undercutting you almost as soon as they're able to get it out of the fermenters. This is a lot more effective with things that really establish new categories or require widespread distribution, things that really are going to make a huge impact. So you won't see it too much in the craft beer world. But for example, in something like hard seltzer, that's a pretty big impact. And if you're able to come high and go low, that there's a lot to be said for that, especially if anybody had any idea what kind of impact it was going to have. You see it a lot more in things where there is true innovation. So in food and beverage, it's a little less common. Now, one thing to keep in mind, just keep in mind what your contribution is, or contribution margin is on your top products. Contribution margin just means effectively how much profit, how much money you're actually making from those products in addition to, or separate from any of your fixed costs. Now, the reason that is important is there is nothing like selling an absolute enormous amount of a product and having it be your number one seller and really pushing it, and then realizing that you're only making a 10% profit on it and that you are slowly going broke by winning so much. You don't want your top selling products, the ones that you are pouring the most money, the most time and attention into, to be the ones that wind up hurting your bottom line the most. So keep an eye on which products are the most profitable for you. And you still have to move volume, and there still has to be consumer demand. But if selling a product in huge volumes today is going to lead to you having problems down the line, it's really worth it. Because even if you're able to capture an enormous number of hugely dedicated fans, good luck keeping them when you can't afford to keep your lights on. And that's an important balance to find. So make sure that you're always keeping your margins at the top of your mind anytime you're making any sort of pricing decisions, because that's what keeps the business running. And the last but not least, one of the most important things is, especially as you are approaching your maximum production capacity, which is a good problem to have, but it's a constant one within the industry. As soon as you start generating enough demand, now you start capping out your current equipment. Now you can go back to the bank, or you can dilute your equity and you can bring in more people and you can buy new equipment, but now you're going to just run into the same problem further out. So as you start approaching the maximum capacity of production that you're able to do on your existing system, certain things that aren't a problem before can become much, much more costly. One of the biggest ones is residency time. If you have a ton of empty fermenters, then making lagers is cheap. It is not a problem whatsoever, because you have the space to dedicate. The time that they're going to spend in a tank, it can throw off your cash conversion cycle, but it's not going to necessarily hurt, your actual return on your production. If you don't have tanks to spare and every single one of them is constantly full, and you have enough demand where you need to be churning out as much product as humanly possible, the extra time that you're going to spend in those lagers can really, really hurt you. And even if you're able to squeeze out extra margin on them versus, any of the ales or any of the quicker beers that you'd be able to make, it has to be enough to justify the time differential. Otherwise, you find yourself in a place where you're losing potential opportunity that you'd otherwise have with different products. Another important thing to keep in mind is that revenue per barrel is the same case. As you start approaching capacity, things that can generate more raw revenue per ounce, per barrel, per gallon, those are going to be a lot more important, even if their actual margins aren't necessarily as good. You see this a lot of times where people start approaching the manufacturing capacity, and they realize that all of a sudden keg beer went from being the most important thing to their business to being a bit of a liability versus package, just because what they don't have any more of is ounces to give. So what they need to do is generate as much revenue, even at lower profit margins, on that packaged beer. Now, obviously, that's a poor example, because whether or not you own your own canning machine can change that equation a lot. But what's important to keep in mind is that as you start capping out your manufacturing capacity, it really does change the equations on a lot of your costing, and you have to keep that in mind as a long-term forecast whenever you're doing any of your pricing. Because if your number one seller is a lager, you might find yourself regretting that down the line, unless you've planned for that capacity constraint as you approach it. That's about all I had today, guys. Appreciate you tuning in. I'll open it up for any questions now. And here's a list of places that you can find me. Go ahead and check us out at communitybrewingventures.com. I'm also a bit of a social media, I wouldn't say darling, more like obnoxious face that won't go away. So feel free to check me out at any of my personal sources as well. And Eric Fowler, could you touch on even odd pricing if you haven't already? Even odd pricing in general, similar to charm pricing, I think it's less important than it really. It's less important than it has been made to be for a long time. A lot more useful is going to be just keeping things simple from a pricing standpoint, particularly if you're dealing with retailers or with directly to consumers. From that standpoint, the fewer impediments they have to making their purchasing decision, usually better off you'll be. There are a couple other psychological pricing tricks. For one, if you can price anything at a $9 versus an $8, and that even extends to other pricing tiers. For example, $19 versus $18, $29 versus $28, that will tend to increase volume. There's been some good research to back that as well. One of the main reasons is that at $9, people see it as being not as expensive as $10. At $8, they see it as being significantly more expensive than $5. So yeah, keep some of those psychological pricing tricks in mind, but they can be over relied on. And if you try getting too cute with them, a lot of times they will wind up not having the intended results. Tiered pricing is probably the most effective one, particularly 3-tiered pricing, if you can pull it off. A lot of breweries have such a wide product selection that winds up biting them a bit as they if they try to stick to 3 strict tiers. But 4 or 5 tiers will usually accomplish roughly the same thing, and that'll give you the freedom to run everything from your wit beer all the way through your barrel aged products. Any other questions out there? And thank you, Ashley. I will do my best to feel better. On the recovery side now, that's the microhuman is already feeling mostly better, which is the chief thing, because I like sleep, and children don't sleep well when they're stopped up. All right, y'all. We appreciate you. You have an excellent day, and I hope to see all of you around the industry soon. Cheers.